Welcome to Cooking with Dave and Audie. I'm Dave, that's Audie. Today we're talking about knife skills. We showed you how to sharpen a knife. I'm sure you've all been practicing at home. Now it's time to start talking about how to use that knife in your kitchen, do it properly and safely. So there are a couple ins and outs, some things we're going to talk about, terms to define, that kind of stuff. But I want to start here. I'm sure everybody's seen this. I'm sure everybody has some idea about what this does. Most people's idea about what this tool is used for is wrong. A lot of people call this a sharpening steel. This does not sharpen a knife in any way, shape, or form. This is a honing steel. And what that means is, as you use your blade, you kind of get little nicks and dings. Because you have a fine edge on your knife, it can kind of roll one way or another a little bit and sort of take away from the performance of that blade. This tool is used to basically just get your blade back in line, so everything's trued up. So depending on how much you use your knife, depends on how much you need to steel your knife. I basically do it once before I start using my knife, and I do it fairly lightly. You want to do this at the same angle you sharpen your knife, so on this blade's about 10-12 degrees, and you want to do it away from the blade, never towards the blade. So from heel to tip on both sides of the knife, a couple of runs lightly across the steel, blade is back in good performance. So we're going to talk about how to use your knife at home and do it properly and safely. So we're going to talk about things like the grip, things to do with your non-dominant hand, different ways you're going to cut down different things, all that kind of stuff. But let's start with the basics. Let's start with the grip. There are basically three different ways you see people holding a knife, and I think the most common one is this one here, with the finger down the spine of the knife like that, and then the rest of the fingers on the handle there. That's wrong. The other way you see people doing it is this, sort of the Excalibur grip, where the fingers are entirely on the handle, and then using a knife like that. That is wrong. So we call this one the accuser because you're always pointing at somebody.
Right.
We call that one Excalibur because it's like you're holding a sword or a weapon. But the proper way to grip a kitchen knife for best use is called the pinch grip. And that's basically this. You grip the knife on the blade with your pointer finger and your thumb below the spine on the blade itself. And then you let the rest of your fingers sort of relax onto the handle. These fingers here are all loose. That's for precision control. The strength of your grip is here in the pinch. The reason why you use a blade this way as compared to other ways is simply this. If you have your finger down the spine, this is the least amount of control and precision you can have. And your knife is very wobbly this way in that. It's hard to control this sort of movement with your knife. And so as you're cutting something, it will rotate on you. You get your finger in the way of the blade and you have a nasty cut. If you hold the knife this way, you have very good control this way, but you don't have very good control this way. And so it's an inefficient cutting technique, even if you're less likely to cut yourself with this grip. When you hold the knife properly, the pinch grip, you get the best of both worlds. You get good control this way, you get good control this way, and then you can use the knife properly. It's sort of, the way you hold it, it sort of becomes an extension of your natural anatomy. If you hold it this way, you have more control through your wrist and elbow and fingers to maneuver the knife so that you can do it safely and efficiently. Now we know how to hold a knife. Your knife is always held in your dominant hand, but your non-dominant hand is just as important as the hand that's holding the knife. Lots of people get scared of putting their fingers, their non-dominant hand, too close to the blade of the knife for fear that it's sharp and you're going to hurt yourself. Rightly so. You just naturally have that sort of instinct. But you have to, in order to use a knife properly, you have to get over that instinct. Your non-dominant hand is sort of held out like a spider, like that, with your fingertips curled under beneath the knuckle of that finger. So my fingertips are curled under the knuckle of that finger, curled under the knuckle of that finger. You always want to have your blade touching at least one of those knuckles. I prefer two. Two's better when you can do it, but it's not always possible. The reason that's important is if this hand is touching that blade, I know where that blade is at all times. I have the most control over it. So as I'm slicing, as long as I keep my fingertips tucked under, there's absolutely no way of cutting myself. If I'm holding produce like this, which is people's natural sort of inclination to do, well, as I cut, I potentially get my fingers underneath the blade of that knife and I cut myself. Holding it this way is basically impossible to do that. The only way you're ever going to cut yourself with this technique is if you bring the blade of the knife above that knuckle. You can shave a little skin off the top of that knuckle. But you're never going to cut the whole fingertip off or anything like that, which you would do with an improper technique in your non-dominant hand. It feels really awkward. Very, very awkward at first. I know that because I felt the same way at one time. You have to really concentrate and focus on proper technique when you first start learning this skill. And then once you learn the technique that works best, and that's the way that works best, it starts to feel better and better. Eventually it feels totally natural, and to do anything else feels really weird. And I say this is the best technique because this is not only the safest technique, but it's the most efficient as far as breaking down meat and fruit and veg in a kitchen. One more thing when we're making cuts, and then we'll move on to actually making some cuts, is we know how to hold our knife, we know how to position our non-dominant hand so that we can work safely and efficiently. The last thing we need to focus on is the knife being perpendicular to the board when we make cuts. You want right angles on this side of the knife and this side of the knife compared to the cutting board and the actual blade of the knife, where the knife is making absolutely vertical cuts straight up and down to the board. If you start to let that knife turn over towards yourself a little bit, you're going to cut yourself. And if you let that knife start to turn over the other way, away from your fingers, you're going to make really ugly, imprecise cuts. That knife needs to be straight up and down vertical. There are a few times where you would use a technique where that is not the case. Like when I'm French slicing onions, I start with the knife turned towards myself, and then as I cut, I rotate it back up to vertical. But in most cases, anything you're going to see me doing today when we start talking about the ins and outs, vertical to the board is how you do it.
Yeah, sashimi cuts are also cut at a bias typically.
If you're doing like a Yanagiba slice,
right.
yeah, you're basically cutting towards.
But you're right.
So that's not always true.
Almost always you're looking for that vertical.
All you gamers out there, is you're learning to use a knife, that you kind of want to focus on that a little bit. So a knife is a blade. It's used to make cuts, and there's a specific motion that needs to be used no matter what cutting technique you're using. It's basically this. As you move your knife down towards your board to make a cut, you also want to be moving the knife away from you or towards you. In other words, the knife is moving in two directions at the same time. You don't want to treat this like a wedge where you just force the knife straight up and down through your food. When people move fast, sometimes that looks like what is happening, but it's not. You want to move the knife away from you in this motion when you're making cuts, or towards you in this motion when you're making cuts, not just straight up and down. There are a couple different cutting techniques that I'm going to introduce to you. They're basic cutting techniques. Is the way you're going to break down almost anything. You get good at these three techniques and you're almost good to go. So the one that's the most basic is the rocking cut. And that's basically holding your knife and not letting your knife come away from the board, and using a rocking motion from the tip to the heel of the knife, using the curve of that blade to sort of rock everything up and down. A very, very controlled way to make precise cuts.
It's a safe way for people that are new with knives in their hands too.
Not quite as fast as technique number 2, which I call the tap slice or the tap chop, where your knife actually comes off of the board and you use little taps to make a slice, and each motion is one slice or chop. You're making a slice, so I use the verb slice. And then the other thing is sort of like that mince thing that you would do on something, where the knife stays on the board and both hands stay on the knife, and you sort of do this thing back and forth to mince garlic or onions.
Yeah, I put my whole palm directly onto the.
Like
so
that, yes.
In my mind, when you're mincing something like garlic or parsley or something like that, that is the safest way, because both hands are completely away from the edge.
Completely out of the way.
Right.
I don't do that very often because I normally chop something down in the shape and size I want, but that takes practice. There's one other way that you're going to grip food, and that's kind of this above grip, which is very different than the few techniques we've talked about. So you're going to grip your product from above, and you're going to get the knife in between your two fingers here, and then make a cut or a slice. When you do that, use 2 fingers, maybe 3 if it's a big product that you have to stabilize, and then keep all your other fingers up, out of the way. You see how my fingers extended up out of the way here. If I'm using this kind of motion, my fingers are extended up, out of the way. That's very important to keep your fingers out of the way. We don't want anyone hurting themselves, but we do want you to get good at using a knife because it's vital to making great food in your home kitchen. That's all the ins and outs as far as verbal communication. Now we're going to have some fun and talk about all kinds of different ways to actually break down food. So we did the vertical slice. That's good for cutting things in half, basically, maybe quarters in some cases. I want to show you another cool technique for cutting things in half, and that's doing multiple things at once. And so I get my palm on top of those tomatoes there, once again lifting my fingers up and out of the way, bringing the knife in horizontal halfway up those tomatoes, and then working it through them that way. That is much more efficient than cutting 20 tomatoes in half individually to do 10 at a time. Now we're going to talk about chopping and slicing. So in general, especially in a home kitchen, slicing is the way to go. Chopping requires multiple steps of breakdown. So normally you would either cheek something or score it one way, cheek something and score it the other way, and then make your final cuts. A slice is a final cut in one motion all in itself. So let's talk about some different ways to slice things down. Basically, a slice is this. One piece of something that comes from one motion of the knife. Each of those are slices. But if I did something like this, even though that's in half, both of those are slices because it uses a slicing motion to make that cut. So let's talk about our roll cuts here. The most precise way, the way I recommend while you're learning. Blade on the board. Your non-dominant hand is controlling that product, basically holding it still. Your knuckles are touching the blade of that knife, and then you start rolling. And you work the knife down towards the product that you're slicing. In other words, I'm not feeding this up under the knife, I'm moving the knife back along the product this way as I cut. So if you start pushing that product up under the knife, eventually you're going to get your finger under it as well and get cut. If you're moving the knife towards your fingers and down your product, you can keep your fingers behind the blade and it's no worries. You can make nice little cuts. The faster way to do it, the way I like to do it, because it's faster, is that tap chop or that tap slice. And that's the same hand positions here, but instead of rocking, which takes a little bit longer due to the motion, we're just going to cut down in quick chops like this. It's the same, exactly the same final product. You can just do it faster. That's the way I prefer to do things. But it's a little bit more dangerous because it's a little bit more out of control, a little bit more likely to cut yourself. But as long as you don't come above your knuckle and as long as you keep your fingertips curled underneath, you're good to go. And so when we talk about, different ways you want to break down things, for professionals, it's sort of important to have serious precision. That every single slice that you make is almost exactly the same thickness is very important. Precision. That's only in a professional kitchen though. For all you home gamers, it doesn't matter, if you're cooking some zucchini for supper, it doesn't matter if they're that thickness or any variation in between. They're even enough, they're going to cook in the same amount of time with the same amount of heat. That's what's important, is uniformity, so that everything cooks evenly in the same amount of time. So if you have a slice that's that big and a slice that's that big, obviously not going to cook at the same time, but a little variation in thickness is totally fine, not going to hurt anything, totally appropriate. It's just about being uniform. So that's the rocking motion, that's the tap, chop, slicing motion. Let's do one where we start to talk about bias. So the motion is exactly the same, except we're going to hold the knife at a bit of an angle to the product, and it's just to make a little bit prettier slices. And so it's the same motion, it's this motion, but instead of doing little coins, little round pieces, we're going to make longer pieces by cutting at an angle. So let's turn that way. Now if I cut it at an angle, now it's the same motion and technique, but I get a different shaped slice out of it. And I think that looks nicer than this does. So I like to use that sometimes for things like carrots, scallions, green onions, that kind of stuff. Even things, squash, cucumbers, I like to do a technique where you kind of do this thing and you cut it into quarters, and then you take a little wedge out of the middle to remove the seeds. And then if you cut that at an angle, you get these little quill-shaped pieces, which sort of match up nicely in size to things like penne pasta. That's sort of same shape and size, and so fit into a dish like that very well, very easily. Nice bite-sized pieces. They look nice. They look a little bit nicer than doing flat slices like that, at least in my opinion. But it's all the same. It achieves the same outcome. That's just being picky about visual presentation. Let's give an example of letting that knife turn towards you or away from you. As I was explaining, it's important for your knife to be perpendicular to the board. Here's an example of why. If I let my knife turn slightly away from me and I cut down, I get a improper slice. It's not even a whole slice. And if I do that a couple of times, then I do get a whole slice, but everything's really sloppy. If I let the knife turn towards myself, it's the same thing. It's really sloppy, but now I'm in danger of actually cutting myself, so I'm not even going to show you that example. But as long as my knife is vertical to the board, perpendicular to the board, I get nice uniform slices. And as you're learning to do this, it's important to understand this. I use a knife quickly, Audie uses a knife pretty quickly. We have a lot of practice, and it's something you just do sort of without even thinking about it after a while. And the reason we use it quickly is because in a professional environment, you're on a time crunch. You need everything done as quickly as possible so you can move on to something else. At home, for people beginning, just learning and practicing, you can go as slow as you ever want to. I mean, it could take you an hour and a half to make a dish that would take me, 20 minutes. It's not a big deal. It's not a race. It's about just having some good dinner. That's what it's about to me. And so having a little bit sort of good technique and be able to practice that good technique is going to make you much more efficient with using a blade. Those are basically the different cuts. I think the only other one, actually two more that are worth showing, things like bell peppers. It has sort of an irregular shape, even between two different bell peppers that came out of the same bin. A lot of people aren't familiar with how to break some of these things down. In general, most things that have a stem on it, whether it's zucchini or a bell pepper or carrots or whatever it is, most of the time you want to nip off that stem. Having a good flat surface to work off of is good for breaking things down and makes it safer where you're less likely to cut yourself. I just rip in and pull out the little seed pod there. And then there's a couple ways you can break this down. I will show you one example that's not my favorite, and then I'll do the rest the way I think it should be done. Gordon Ramsay and a few other chefs do this kind of thing where they sort of peel the bell pepper like that and make a couple of cuts and then break this down. I like to do where you also nip this side, so it's square on this end, square on that end, and then you just break that down into some big sort of flat pieces. Let me show you why I think that's a better way. You go back and you sort of remove the little rib piece there. Normally you would discard that. Now the next thing you would do to break pieces like this down is to cut them into sticks. If you have these little weird pieces that I sort of peeled off, the first couple of cuts you make, like for instance this one, and that one, aren't really usable because there was an ugly unsquare edge to the end of that. Same thing right here. You can see if I take a slice right there, it's not even a full slice, it's in two pieces. The next one, sort of the same thing. Really thin in the middle, big on each end. Not a great way to sort of break that down efficiently. It's more wasteful. If you break it down into bigger, flatter pieces like that are more or less square already. Now these two edges aren't exactly parallel, but closer than these, so you don't waste. You can use every slice, even the first one, and they're all uniform in shape and size. That's the way I like better only because it's less wasteful. You can do it whatever way that you want. Then if you wanted to dice something like this, you would break it down into a couple of sticks. You would lay those sticks down, and then you would cut this way at sort of the same thickness as you cut the sticks into. So something like that right there is a dice. And it doesn't matter if you do that bigger or smaller or whatever else. The only other one I want to show is something really weird like fennel. So fennel's a big bulb. It's got these stalks coming up out of it. You just nip off those stalks.
Do not throw that away.
What I love about fennel is every part of it is edible. Its seeds and flowers are edible. Its stems and leaves are edible. Its bulb is edible. Its roots are edible. And it all tastes delicious. One of my very favorite things, especially in the spring and summertime. But it has a very weird shape and sort of symmetry to it. Most people really struggle with trying to break something like this down in any usable, sort of efficient way. So there's a line of symmetry going this way, so it's symmetrical on this side and this side, rather than this side and this side. But it doesn't want to sort of sit very stable, so I can make a cut through it. So what I do is make one cut down that line of symmetry so that it's in two sort of equal halves. Now I have a flat side that can sit on, so as we make other cuts, it's nice and stable. It's not trying to roll around. And then you could either, slice this in any sort of direction that you want. I basically just go flat, and we make our nice little slices of fennel. And then you sort of just break all that up, and it's pretty uniform in shape and size. Any good knife is high carbon steel, which even if it's sort of marketed as stainless steel, is pretty susceptible to moisture as far as damaging that steel. Basically it rusts. If you get rust on the actual edge of your knife, you got to do a lot of damage repair. That's what happened to the knife that you saw us sharpening. And sometimes you get rust and stuff up on the higher parts of the blade, which really is no big deal other than it doesn't make it look very nice. But you got to take care of this tool with pretty attention to detail, especially if it's a really good knife. So you don't ever want to leave it moist. In fact, even in between different products that I cut down, whether, in between these things, I would wipe down the blade of my knife just to keep it dry as possible. Now, as far as washing these knives, which you're going to have to do, a little bit of warm soapy water, not even hot, but warm soapy water. Carefully scrub the knife down, and I'll give you a couple of tips about how to do that. Never turn the blade towards yourself. So if you're wiping the blade of a knife and you wipe it with the blade towards yourself, this knife is more than sharp enough to cut right through that towel and then into my other hand. So I turn the blade away from myself and I just kind of pinch the knife with this other hand and pull the knife through. And there's not any real good possibility of me cutting myself. Same with your washing your knife. Get your little sponge or your little scrubber and come from the side with the blade away from yourself. Give it a little scrub down, a little rinse, and not hot water, but warm water, and then make sure that knife is really nice and dry before you're ready to put it away. Where do I put it away, Dave? Well, it's hard to say.
I'm sorry, real quick about washing. It goes without saying, you didn't even think about it because you would never do it. Do not put your knife in a dishwasher.
Oh, God, I'm glad you said that, Audie. Yeah. So we've mentioned a couple of times that temperature variation could really damage your knife. This is tempered steel. That means it's gone through a process of high temperature to low temperature back up to a higher temperature, so that has the best balance of performance between hardness and toughness. That's a whole other video or podcast. But putting your knife in a dishwasher gets it up to a temperature where it changes the temper on your knife, and it will never ever hold a good proper edge on it again. It's absolutely ruined. The same thing when you sharpen a knife by one of those things that you drag a knife through. It's got little tungsten carbide bits on it that you drag your knife through. Once again, damages the temperature of your knife, hits too high of a temperature through friction, and it ruins your temper. It'll never be a good knife again. Couldn't put a good edge on it if you wanted to. That's a totally other video or two. Then when you're done washing your knife and it's properly dry, you want to put it in a place that's dry and safe. What do I mean safe? I mean it's not going to fall and stab somebody, or somebody's going to reach in and grab it and accidentally cut themselves. And it needs to be away from other hard materials. So any other steel or aluminum or copper or something that could touch the edge of this blade and damage it. So for example, don't throw it in a drawer with all your tongs and ladles and salad spoons and all that kind of stuff. It needs to be in a place that's just for this, that's safe and dry, where it's not going to be damaged or harmed. That could be all kinds of places. Could be in a knife roll, could be in a drawer, could be in a cabinet, on a shelf, on a counter. You could have your own little sheath or cover for it, lots of different options. But that's the ins and outs of how to sort of get used to using a knife properly, safely, efficiently. I hope you've learned something. I'd like to do more of this kind of stuff in the future and sort of build on the previous videos and that foundation of knowledge. Because I think being able to use a knife is really important as far as having fun in your kitchen. If you like our stuff, subscribe to our channel. Leave likes on your favorite videos. If you have any questions, leave us a comment. Tell us what you want to see us do. Tell us what you enjoyed, what you didn't enjoy. We appreciate you taking your time to watch us. Have an awesome day.